Hey, deserving listeners. Today's episode, I want to talk about a loss that I have experienced. My mentor, Phil Cushman, died tragically last week. He was walking in the evening while talking on the phone around his neighborhood and on Vashon Island, which is just outside Seattle. It's really rural out there. And he was walking and talking on the phone with someone, and he was hit by a car tragically. And it was a hit and run. The person on the phone with him, suddenly the phone goes quiet and he's thinking, what happened? He waits a bit. He calls his wife, Phil's wife, asks, is he home yet? They, I think, called the authorities. The police found him on the side of the road and he was dead. He was 77 years old. I just talked to him a few weeks ago on the phone, which I consider to be very valuable to me. We had a really long, in-depth, meaningful conversation, which was always the case with Phil Cushman. So let me talk about mentorship and supervision, because that is something that I am passionate about. As a supervisor, as a mentor myself, I have tried to model myself after good supervisors and superior mentors in my life. It's not uncommon for clinicians, especially after 25 years and especially after a lot of graduate degrees, to have a lot of supervisors and a lot of mentors, a lot of professors that are there to guide you and help you. And I've had almost 20 supervisors in my life. And although Phil Cushman technically was never a supervisor of mine, he was a true mentor in that he guided me, he helped me, he fought for me when people were falsely doing things about me, which I won't go into, but he believed me, he advocated for me, he used his power and his connections to help me and to, like I said, fight for me. And I didn't need him to fight for me so much as to have him believe in me. These are important aspects of mentorship. And when I wrote a book, the only book I've ever written was on supervision and mentorship. And research shows that clinicians, good clinicians who end up having good outcomes with their clients, are partially determined by their supervisors, the quality of their supervision and mentorship. And I can attest to that you can learn a lot in graduate school, but you need to have a wise mentor that guides you, not only teaches you, but shepherds you. There's so many emotional pitfalls and so many other kinds of pitfalls that one can fall into as a novice clinician. And in order to navigate those effectively, you have to have not only a good supervisor, but an excellent supervisor, someone who really knows what they're doing, can really pay attention to you, can allow you to explore your own clinical opinions and approaches, but also to guide you and challenge you. Phil challenged me in some dramatic ways. He always pushed me, but he always believed in me. That was another thing that maybe I'll get into, but he was just a true supervisor. And I find that a lot of talk, a lot of instruction on supervision will focus on the oversight. You know, when you have a clinician and a supervisor, obviously there's some oversight, meaning that you need to make sure that they're not screwing up. There's also a gatekeeping role to make sure that they're fit to be a therapist. And there's instructional roles as a supervisor, like here's how you do this, But a major component, as evidence and research will show, is the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee is critical to supervision quality, to learning, to allowing the trainee to feel comfortable to tell the supervisor things. The trainee has to trust that the mentor supervisor believes in them and is a safe person to approach. Attachment theory is actually applied in the research, and I write about that a lot in my book. You need to have a secure attachment to your supervisor and to your mentor. I did an inventory of all the supervisors that I've had in my life, and a good number of them, the majority of them, were mediocre. Were not people that I respected or felt safe with or that really pushed me to grow. So a good number of them were, they were fine, but they weren't great. And then I had some at the low end who were abusive and horrible in my life. But at the top end, there were a small group of supervisors who were true supervisors, people who taught me, who held me emotionally, guided me, gave me wisdom, the kinds of people that stick with me when I am thinking clinically, when I am writing, when I am podcasting, when I'm teaching. Their voice is in my head, and Phil Cushman is at the top of that list. even though, like I said, he was never technically a supervisor of mine. I did talk with him about cases, but mainly he was just a career mentor. We were actually colleagues together. He was a professor at Antioch University, he was right up until the time he died. And that's how I met him, as his office was next to mine. And as you know, we were two professors, but he was a lot older than me and a lot more experienced and a lot smarter and had done so much more with his life. And I just loved talking with him. And when I went back to school to get my doctorate, he was also not only my colleague, but also my professor. I was a professor at the university, and then I also got my doctorate at the university. So my colleagues were also my professors, if that makes any sense. And Phil was one of those people. So I've cried a lot of tears. My wife Stacy came into my office the other night, and she just looked white as a ghost. And I don't think I've ever seen a face like that before. And she's going to tell me something. I'm thinking, oh my God, are my parents dead? It's just the look on her face. When she told me, I went into kind of a mini state of shock. I was like, what? And so I looked up the story and read the news about it, that it was a hit and run, and he was walking, he was on the phone, and I'm just, what? I just talked to him. I just kept saying that. And behind me is my bookshelf, my books, and he has authored a number of really important works. One of his books, actually, this one is a book that I love. Philip Cushman is his proper full name, I guess. I was looking for this book. I found his other two books that I have, but I was trying to find this book as, I don't know, just some kind of tether to him. I'm talking with Stacy, and I'm going from bookshelf to bookshelf. And I moved a year ago, and my books were meticulously organized before the move. But since the move a year ago, I haven't had time to organize my books, and some of my books are actually in the garage still in boxes. So I'm looking and I'm thinking, it's got to be here somewhere, because I must have looked at it in the past year, right? I'm looking for it, and I find his other two books. I'm like, okay, there's that one, there's that one. There's that one that he actually assigned in one of his classes, and I'm, finding all these books on the shelf that are related to him, and I couldn't find the main book that I associate him with, and I couldn't find it. It felt very bad to me that I couldn't find his book as I'm sort of frantically in shock about his death. And so then I called Rebecca Bloom, whom some of you know from the audio podcast. She was a professor with me at Antioch and knew Phil as well. They are both Jewish, so I think that they had bonded in that way as well. And so I called her, Rebecca, and told her about it because I didn't think she had heard, and she hadn't. And so we started talking and reminiscing about Phil, and I was telling her about him and about everything that and that's when I started to cry. That's just reminiscing about him. I was sobbing, and so it's tragic because I actually was going to have him on the podcast. Okay, so I had to take a break just now because I was getting heartburn. I don't usually get heartburn, but I think it's talking about this is upsetting my constitution. So, where was I? Yeah, so I was going to have him on the podcast. I've been bothering him to be on the podcast for years and years because he's so brilliant and his ideas are rare and important, very important. He doesn't just have ideas about psychology. It's about our society and our culture and history and where we're headed and how we see ourselves and what therapy means and how to evaluate things. That's the thing that he really taught me was he never told me what to think. He always taught people how to think. He taught people to evaluate things, to take a step back, to be humble, to recognize that our ideas, our very values at the core of ourselves are socially constructed, are given to us by culture. And it doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that they're particular and they're not universal. When we look around the world, other people have different values about what is life, why are we here, who are we, what is the self? And psychology has a big influence on the Western mainstream American idea of what is the self. And I won't go into the detail about that. You can read his book. I mean, it's Constructing the Self, Constructing America, a Cultural History of Psychotherapy. It's about how over time, and I'm going to butcher it because it's over my head, that over time and in different cultural regions, there are different definitions of who we are. And when we understand how we construct the self, how we socially construct the self, then we understand our psychotherapeutic models, because the models are geared toward how we see the self and how we see illness, how we see pathology, how we see health, which has changed over the years. 500 years ago in Western societies, it was different than 2,000 years ago. There were very different ideas. Well, anyway, so I wanted to have him on the podcast to meet y'all because just wanted him to be more of a part of my regular life, and I thought that'd be a good way to do that. I also want to get his ideas out there because he's a prolific writer, a prolific speaker. As a person who comes from academia and from science and from publishing, I have always advocated for professors and thinkers in my field to get on the internet. Your research paper might be on the internet. Your dissertation might be on the internet. You might get interviewed for some Psychology Today article or something, or cited, but that is very limited. The ability, like myself, I'm getting heartburn again. Ugh, my stomach. All right, so where was I? Yeah, so I've, for a long time, been really trying to convince my colleagues, and particularly people like Phil Cushman, to get their ideas on YouTube into a podcast format, into a format that people actually pay attention to. People don't read dense books. Some do, obviously, but the masses don't, and the masses need to know this stuff. With all the information on the internet, there's so much misinformation and charismatic people that are swaying people in various different ways and bad ways. We need the wise to be on the internet. We need the people who are worthy of our fellowship, people like Phil Cushman. So I was always trying to get him, but on the internet and on my podcast. But our last phone conversation, I really kind of went for it. Part of it was we were talking about our careers because we're both therapists, we're both professors at Antioch, and he is still publishing. He was writing a book. Oh, I just realized that he hadn't finished. He was talking about how in his old age he didn't have the stamina to write all day like he used to. Whenever you're writing a book, having published myself, I can relate, but more recently I can relate when I'm publishing a deep dive. You can't work on it piecemeal. You have to have full, long stretches of uninterrupted time. For him, he was finding that that window of time that he could withstand and keep his brain sharp was shorter. He was still very sharp. On the phone, I could tell all of his faculties were still there, but his, like I said, his stamina. So he was talking about that. And so I was trying to really push for him to be on my YouTube channel and podcast more so than I have in the past, because I thought, well, maybe if it's hard for him to write, he could maybe get his ideas out there through interviews, this kind of thing. The other thing that I was trying to convince him was I was telling him that I was pretty much a full-time content provider, podcaster and YouTube channel person, and oh, my stomach. Oh boy, that's pretty bad. So I was talking about how I'm a full-time content, and my practice is very small, and I'm actually not currently teaching at Antioch. I'm teaching off and on at Antioch. I'm just not teaching this term. He was like, really? Wow, so you're a full-time internet person with a blog and that kind of thing. And he's like, how do you pay your bills? And so, I was giving him the lowdown on that. And this was him. Even though he barely understood it and it wasn't his world and I wasn't asking for this, he stopped the whole conversation and really spent some time focusing on what a change this was for my life and for my career, and what an accomplishment it was. It makes me want to cry just thinking about it, that he didn't have to do that, right? He didn't have to. He could have been like, oh, what's what most people do. It's like, oh, you're a YouTube person. Anyway, moving on with life. I mean, who really cares? But to him, he's like, wait, so people actually pay attention to what you're saying? And you're putting stuff out there that's compelling to people? And he really just said, wow, that's such an accomplishment, Kirk. Like, look what you've done. That's what a mentor is. Like someone that can hear that and pay attention to that. I didn't need that, you know what I mean? But it felt good to have him be proud of me and to appreciate it, especially given that it's not his world. I mean, he's older and also just completely not of that world. And I think also kind of resists it because he is skeptical of our ever-changing world. He wasn't resistant to it, but he had a lot of critiques of it. Our further dive into materialism and capitalism and seeing ourselves as computers. Sometimes you might hear me say things like, we're not computers. Sometimes people talk about how our long-term memory is like a hard drive and our short-term memory is like RAM and all these analogies to computers. And he was very critical of that because one, it's wrong. You talk to any neuroscientists, they're like, no, our brain is not a hard drive and our short-term memory is not RAM. It's much more complicated than that. Neural networks, and it's a squishy mess in our brain. It's very imprecise, but also very elegant, and it is far powerful in a lot of ways than any kind of computer. So anyway, he was critical of that, but he was also critical of how that notion that we are computers, that our brain is like a computer, is a part of the power structure. He was very good at breaking down the power structure in ways that aren't so obvious. And by the way, when he would teach, so our classes at Antioch are 3 hours long, and he had no PowerPoint. He would just sit down with his pad and paper, and I get chills thinking about it because me and all of my classmates were riveted by him. I mean, we would have professors that would use visuals, and some of them were more boring than Phil, when Phil would just sit there in his chair with all of us in a circle. Before class started, he would take these notes, and very well-written cursive notes, and old school legal pad with a felt tip pen, and it was you could see all the notes there, and dense, and you just think, what's on those notes? And he would just riff on his notes. And I guess, that's what the podcast became for me. I take my notes in my own compulsive bullet list, which I'm actually kind of looking at right now. I took some notes on what I might talk about. I'm way off topic, by the way, but he would just talk for 3 hours and interact with us and raise ideas. And I'll never forget that this feeling that I would get most of the time walking out of his class. I felt like my world was upside down, not only intellectually, brain-wise, but also physically. I remember feeling off kilter walking out of his classroom, seeing the world through a different lens, almost like Neo of the Matrix. He would show you the world. He would show you, like, let me show you what the world is. Let me tell you your value system, what you take for granted. Your assumptions about things are just that. They are assumptions. They aren't truth. They are things that have been given to you by a power structure and by society. And they're not necessarily bad, but they're not necessarily good. And you need to be able to look at them, because to be a good therapist, you have to be able to evaluate that, because the way in which you try to help another human being is determined by the societal messages and assumptions and constructs that have been given to you. And the problems of your clients might also be related to butting up against those messages. For example, if you have a black client who has absorbed the message that they are lesser, and they feel like they are lesser, and they have low self-esteem, and they are demoralized often. The black oppressed client comes into your office and says, I feel depressed. You don't just give them a pill, and the client might not even know why they're depressed. But if you have an ability to zoom out and go like, well, let's look at it from these various different angles. Let's ask some questions, and maybe we can determine that actually what's happening to you is society. I'm simplifying it. Or as a therapist, the assumptions that I have and the values that I hold, what is good in life? Why are we here on this planet? What's the purpose? There is no right or wrong answer to that, really. And now, he wasn't a cultural relativist, and he was very critical of that. For those of you that kind of know this, he wasn't a postmodernist. He didn't just throw everything out the door. He said that there's a tradition called hermeneutics. The process is through discourse, that we can actually decide what is good in life. We can actually determine what we should be doing on this planet as individuals and as a group and as a profession and as a nation. We can determine that. We're not just, life is not meaningless. It does have meaning, but we have to be able to evaluate it, and we have to have conversations and a discourse with others, trying to determine, why are we here? What are we doing with ourselves? And what values do we want to teach our children? If we don't ask these questions and come to answers that are good, then we are doomed to give in to the power structure, to the oppressor, to the capitalist, to the man, to the person who benefits from us being sheeple. And if we can do this as a collective, grassroots, then we don't have to listen to the power structure. We can define for ourselves, for the masses, what is good in life. And some of you might think, oh, this is Marxism or something. It's not. It's deeper than that in a lot of ways. I won't go into the details, and I barely understand it myself. So I was wondering why I did not have this book on my shelf. Why were all these other books, I don't know if you can see all the books, but a lot of the books on my shelf, especially like certain shelves, are frequent books that I will grab for various different reasons. I felt like I had betrayed Phil by not having this. I had two of his other books and books that he had assigned to me, like I said, but I didn't have this book. And I'm thinking, this is the one that's dear to me, and this is the one he would assign in his classes. This is the one that he would pour over with us and me. I just thought, why was this for over a year now? Why was it in the garage in a box? And the thing that I'll say is that Phil was intimidating with his knowledge, including his book. I barely understand his book. I think he would appreciate this analysis, conceptualization of myself as being scared of humiliation and the acknowledgement that I don't know everything, and kept his book in the garage to avoid the acknowledgement that I'm a human being or something. I don't know, it makes me want to cry thinking about him laughing right now. He'd just be like, oh, Kirk, you're at it again. But all right, so I thought I would read some passages. And he was such a great writer. And when I would write for him in his classes, it was terrifying. As not only just a published professor, but he was published among the greats in relational psychoanalysis, in hermeneutics, in cultural critique. When we would want one of the professors to fight back against the administration, against the man, we got Phil because he could do the job. And that was another part of our conversation on the phone, me and Phil, was there's been a cultural change at my university and also I think in our field that has moved away from, I don't know what Phil would say. I think he would say we've moved towards more scientific and competency-based to try to make our field of psychotherapy into a mechanistic, provable science, which he was not supportive of. And he said it's fine, research is fine, and these kinds of ideas are fine, competencies are fine, but we need to focus much more of our attention on the human aspects of psychotherapy and psychology, because that's really where it's at. And this run towards justifying ourselves by becoming more hard science is a sign of insecurity, is a sign of desperation. We should own who we are. We can absolutely do quote unquote hard science, but at the core of our identity, of our worth, is in philosophy, in awareness, is not in numbers. We can look at that stuff, but we have to have wisdom. In fact, one of the very first conversations I can remember having with him was when I was trying to determine my dissertation during my doctorate. I was just brainstorming, and I went into his office and I said, I have an idea for a dissertation. And he's like, okay, let's talk about it. This is another great thing about mentors I get chills thinking about is, they're there for you. They'll put their pen down, they'll close their computer and they'll listen. It makes me cry again. Because it's not always the case. You would think that professors would be that way, but they're not always that way. And I don't think I've always been that way for my mentors, which I feel guilty about. So I tried to, and for some I did, I think. But so I went into his office and I told him I had this idea for a dissertation, which was to study wisdom within psychotherapy, because when I started my doctorate, I'd already been a therapist for a while. And so I thought in my travels that really what differentiates my later work from my early work was wisdom. And maybe a definition of it is a collection or the emerging property of experience, knowledge, hard work, intelligence, consultation, influence from others, letting the world influence you, pulling things together. Whatever we call all of that, I would call it wisdom. You can't teach that. You can't teach wisdom. You can't purposely develop it. You have to set out. I could look at a bunch of pictures and videos about climbing the Himalayas, but if I had never done it, I wouldn't know it. It wouldn't be in my bones. I could read book after book. I could study climbing in theory. I could talk to people about what it's like to climb, but I wouldn't know it in my bones. To be a good therapist, to be a true integrationist of knowledge and humanness and experience, you have to pull all that together. You have to be there. As a therapist, after a number of years, you have that. You've been in session for thousands of hours, and if you work at it and search for that wisdom, climb that mountain, you gain that experience. It doesn't mean that you're beyond mistakes. You're always going to make mistakes, but there's an assuredness and it's not intuition. I want to say it's like to expert NBA players when they take a shot, they don't think, okay, you do this now. It just emerges from their body because they've done it so many times. They didn't do it well in the beginning, but they just kept at it, and then it becomes automatic. And that's what it's like, I think, to be a true excellent therapist, is to have that automaticness to it. You don't phone it in. You don't just do the same thing every time, but a wisdom emerges from you because you've worked at it. Again, it's not routinized behavior as a therapist. It's spontaneous, it's reactive. You might do brand new things in every session, but it emerges out of that wisdom. And so I was talking with him about this, and he was listening to me, and I think most professors would have said, well, Kirk, that's impossible to put into a study. Like, you're getting way too big, and your dissertation should be pared down to something small. Wouldn't you just like to, send a survey to some people and report on the numbers? So much easier to do that. He didn't say that. What he said was, wow, Kirk, you're a really deep thinker. And he wasn't sarcastic, he meant it. I was like, oh, okay, well, thanks. And that's, and then we talked a little bit more about it, but that was kind of his big meta observation of me. I think that's when we clicked, was he thought, I don't know. But like I said earlier, like, he had a way of making every student feel like they were the only student. A lot of my classmates would probably say similar things about Phil, that they felt like he zeroed in on them, like he really paid attention. He would stop. Him and I, when we would bump into each other in the hallway or at the copy machine, because again, we're colleagues. And after I graduated with my doctorate, we were only colleagues again. I wasn't just a colleague and a student of his, but he was still a mentor of mine, but we became much more equals, if you will, as time went on. And I'd go to the copy machine and he'd be there, and he was just one of those. I was usually frazzled and running around and, get out of my way. I got shit to do. And he was always like, he would just stop. He often wore a nice button-up shirt with a sweater vest on. He had very wise eyes and a very soft smile, and he would always just stop. And, I always got the sense like he was probably going to be late to something by stopping, but he would always stop and, oh, Kirk, it's good to see you. Let me tell you about anyway, I was going to read this passage. And this doesn't do it justice. It's just one sentence, but I thought I would just read some of this because it'll give you an idea of what it's the first sentence of the second paragraph of this, very big book. When social artifacts or institutions are taken for granted, it usually means that they have developed functions in the society that are so integral to the culture that they are indispensable, unacknowledged, and finally invisible. When social artifacts or institutions, so ideas and, capitalism is an institution. Social artifact would be like sexism, racism, this kind of thing, or take it for granted, it usually means that they have developed functions in the society that are so integral to the culture that they are indispensable, unacknowledged, and finally invisible, meaning that they become just part of the landscape and you can't see them anymore for what they are. They just become the way that we think. Sex negativity is one that I often will talk about, that you just take for granted. Like, well, of course it's disgusting that this and that, or of course that's deplorable behavior. You can't do that. And when you really look at it, you think, well, why? And people will have all sorts of justifications. A lot of my ability to stand tall when making those kind of arguments came from Phil and his eloquent leadership regarding this sort of thing. Another passage here. Psychotherapy and its relationship to the United States is anything but simple. It is one of the most complex, colorful, and strange artifacts of the modern era. You often hear me talk about a panopticon. I got that from him on page 98, and he got it from Foucault, who got it from Bentham. But anyway, here's another. The body of the 19th century woman spoke what her mouth could not. Sedimented in the body was the grief and anger for which the language had no words and the society had no toleration. So this is a part of a longer section about how women in Victorian Western world, England, United States, Eastern United States, were framed by the medical community as hysteria. And I won't go into the full detail on this, but when we study this stuff and you look through the lens of today onto the past, and you sort of chuckle at the way things used to be in the 19th century, then you say, well, in 150 years, how are they going to laugh at us? And that's a very important thing to always be asking yourselves. Because what's the chance that today we have achieved full wisdom and we will never learn anymore? But anyway, so what he's saying here in this sentence is that women define themselves because it was constructed for them, that the pressures and the grief and the pain of oppression that women were going through, the pigeonhole that they were being shoved into all the time, they didn't have a way, technology, as one might say, or a method of expressing one's grievance about it. The power structure was so anti-woman that you were stuck. And then you were indoctrinated. So not only were you prevented from telling other people, but you prevented yourself from even thinking it because you had been indoctrinated into a society that downplayed all sorts of things, not only emotion in general, but women in particular. And the body, as he's saying, through conversions and somatic complaints, physical complaints, fits and hallucinations and numbness, paralyzation, various different things that they would frame as hysteria. It's like all these women are kind of freaking out, all having these weird symptoms, and will attribute it to the uterus because what's different about a woman? And they don't think of it emotionally speaking because we didn't define the self emotionally in the 19th century. We define the self in a much different way. And so the individuals that are suffering, they express their pain through the definition of the self that has been passed down to them, through physical means, through numbness and paralyzation and blindness. And this is a way for the self to express pain, because everyone knew, including their unconscious, that if they expressed it verbally, no one would listen or might throw them into an asylum or slap them across the face or something. And so again, I just want to read this sentence again. The body of the 19th century woman spoke what her mouth could not. So the body spoke what her mouth could not. Sedimented in the body was the grief and the anger for which the language had no words and the society had no toleration. So it's just that that's just one sentence, my friend. That's just one sentence. It's dense. Every sentence is important. And you could spend a lifetime with one sentence in this book. And there's so many things like that. And I think that's why I unconsciously left it in the garage, because it's intimidating, and those are the sentences I get. There's others I don't. And he references things in here in history and philosophy, and I'm always like, just to understand that section, I'm gonna have to learn about Heidegger and Gadamer and Foucault and all these. Like I don't have time for that. But he would challenge me to do that. He would really try to push me. So leads me to another aspect of our relationship that I want to grieve about, which is that when we were on the phone a few weeks ago, I wanted to tell him I appreciated him. I will do that occasionally with him. I just want to be like, hey, I just want to tell you. Because there was a time in my life when he really grounded me in a way that no one else was doing, and so many other people could have. And so many other people were pushing me off kilter. Phil was there for me, really in a unique way, in a human way, in a true kind of father figure, very important figure for me in my life, in my career, really, keeping me on the path. So I wanted to thank him for that. And I think I might have even told him that out of the dozens of supervisors and mentors I've had, like I hold him at absolutely the top of that list. And he's like, oh, thanks, it's good to hear that. And then he says, well, can I tell you something, Kirk? And I'm like, yeah, go ahead. This is real time. Let's get real together. And then he heads into a topic that sounds negative, like he's building up to something negative. And I'm like, I'm pacing around my office right here, and which I do when I'm on the phone, and I'm tense, I'm worried, but I felt safe. I felt like, well, I can trust Phil, but I was concerned. I'm like, where's this headed? He starts to tell me about how when I was in my doctorate program and I had developed my dissertation topic and was pulling together my dissertation committee, which you will pull together 3 people, and you get to choose as a student who's going to be in your dissertation committee as professors or leaders in the community. They don't have to agree, but you approach them and then they agree or decline. And he told me that he was hurt emotionally that I had not asked him to be on my dissertation committee. And he was sad about that and asked me why I didn't ask him to be on his dissertation committee. And I was taken aback. It's been many years since I did my dissertation, particularly since I chose my dissertation committee. And it took me a while to remember why I didn't choose him, because when he said that, I'm like, yeah, why didn't I choose you? You would have been the first person I should have chose, because you're the person I trust the most, the person I respect the most, the person that I knew the best. Why would I choose not you? I couldn't really remember. And then as we were talking about, well, first off, I apologize. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry. But then I thought about it, like, well, the reason I told him, which was true, but, to be honest, I left out another reason, which I'll tell you. But one of the reasons was that I didn't think he had the time for it because he was so busy with other things. He was a very active academic and speaker and lecturer and writer. And I just thought, he doesn't have time for me. He's busy. I don't want to bother him. And another reason was my dissertation topic wasn't, well, I don't know, it kind of was in his wheelhouse. I mean, certainly just as much as the professors I chose. But another reason that I didn't tell him on the phone, and probably only realized until later, which was that he was a tough professor. He was hard. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever admitted this out loud or even admitted it to myself. I chose people to be on my dissertation committee that I thought would go easy on me, that would challenge me, and people I respected. I mean, the 3 professionals and professors I had on my dissertation committee are really top notch. Anyway, so I think I might have avoided Phil because I still have antacid pills in my mouth. My stomach feels better now. I was worried that he would make me rewrite my dissertation 10,000 times because he was such a perfectionist, not in a bad way. I mean, he was a very accomplished writer, very precise speaker. In fact, I've been doing this podcast for 14 years, and in the beginning of the podcast, when he was my professor, I was still rough around the edges in terms of my presentations and my speaking ability, and my precision wasn't very good. I wasn't very precise. Through his mentorship and experiencing him, not only just one-on-one conversations, but also him as a lecturer and as a writer and as a professor, I tried to absorb his style of prose and of presentation and of precision, the ability to say a sentence and have it mean so many things at the same time. Every word is important. There's no wasted space. Which leads me to another story. I was a student in his class. Like I was saying earlier, he made everyone feel like they were the only student in the class. And I was terrified about writing papers in his class because he took so much time and he edited them with freehand, though kind of an old school editing style where there's notations that he would write, like there were symbols, and he taught us about kind of old school editing. He wouldn't use computers, so you'd hand it in hard copy and he would mark it up, and he scrutinized every word, every sentence. Because sometimes you got this impression that the professor barely read your paper or might not have read it at all. They would sometimes you wouldn't even get the paper back from the professor and you'd pass the class. You'd be like, so I guess they read the paper? And it feels like, well, I passed. But on the other hand, when you put your heart and soul into something, you really want to know what the professor thinks. You're paying a lot of money, or it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to go into the degree. And it also shows that the professor cares. And so when you see a professor cares, like, you work harder. You work at really writing the paper with more care. For professors that we knew might not even read the paper, you say, well, why put my heart and soul into this? I don't even know if they're going to read this thing, or they're only going to read the first few pages or something. So with Phil, you really had to write. So I was writing this one paper and just felt completely out of my depth. I turned in the paper thinking, well, I don't know how this is going to go because he's such a great writer and he has such high expectations. And he gives me the paper back the next week and he says, Kirk, this is a really good paper. In fact, I think this is publishable with the American Psychological Association. You could submit this thing and get it published. And I'm like, a what? Like, I thought I was going to flunk your class. And not only is it a good paper, passable, but you're saying it's an excellent paper and you're saying it's publishable? Like, I have confidence in a lot of things in my life. There are things that I have developed confidence around. Writing has never been one of them, particularly back then. I knew of myself as a poor writer. Just as an example of this, in high school, I was in all the AP classes because, I don't know, I was a nerd. And I was placed in the AP English advanced placement. So it's like the Smarties class. And I was put in the English class in ninth grade, the AP English class, which was a big mistake. And incidentally, Brian Yorkie was a classmate of mine who ended up writing Next to Normal, the Tony Award-winning musical, and 13 Reasons Why. He also is the showrunner of that show anyway. And so that's what I was sitting next to, someone who understood Shakespeare and was about to write Tony Award-winning plays and musicals. And I'm sitting next to Brian Yorkie, and then there's me. And so we were often assigned in ninth grade papers that we would have to write. We'd have to write a paper on a Shakespeare play that we had written or read. And so for me, what that meant, and I would go to the teacher, I'd be like, so what's the minimum requirements for this paper? Not because I was trying to get out of it, but because I was so bad at writing. I'm like, I need to know the minimum. And she said, well, it needs to be 5 paragraphs, intro, body, conclusion. And in order to have and I'd be like, well, how many sentences does a paragraph have to be? I mean, that's how bad of a writer I was. And she says, well, every paragraph has to be at least 3 sentences. So in my head, I'm like, okay, that's 15 sentences. I hope I can do that. I would go home on Friday and I would sit on my bed all Friday night, all Saturday, all Sunday, staring at this piece of paper with my pen. I would, cobble it together. I'd be like, oh, okay, well, hopefully this is passable. I'd go to school, and just before English class, my classmate, she looks at me and she's like, oh, we have that paper due next class. I haven't written my essay. And I'm like, well, you're doomed because it takes me like 48 hours. She, in 5 minutes, writes an essay on Shakespeare that's longer and better than mine. In 5 minutes, she's and I'm like, okay, clearly there's something wrong with me. I later have learned I actually have mild dyslexia. Anyway, I'm looking at her, I'm like, okay. I'm good at math and chemistry and science and physics, and I'll just stick to that. I'm clearly not a good writer, and I don't know how to do that. So I've always been behind. And by the time I was in my doctoral program, even though I'd already been a professor and had graded a lot of papers, incidentally, which through experience I figured out how to do well enough, I did not consider myself to be a good writer. But there I am sitting in front of Phil, and he's saying, this is an excellent paper. And I'm like, are you sure it was my paper? I'm on cloud nine. I walk out of that class going, I'm a good writer? I'm a good writer. Wait, I wrote a good paper? Huh? And I'm like, okay. But Phil, like he's a genius. He's the tip-top writer in our university. If he says it's true, then, and he really meant it. He didn't just say, hey, great paper. Like he really, eye contact, sits me down, pays attention to me. And I'm like, okay. So I'm walking, I'm like, okay. So I can publish this thing. Well, that's kind of nice. I wrote a paper. Let's publish this. Let's get this out there. I mean, the world needs to know the ideas I came up with this paper. Halfway through the week between classes, it starts to dawn on me like, well, wait, I think he said it was almost ready for publication. And I meant what I read that to be is like, it was 99% ready for publication. Just needed some tweaking. As the week went on, I'm like, well, what's almost? Is that 99% or is that 1%? And again, I'm not a writer at this point. It wasn't until later that I became more of a writer and would learn that when someone says you're on your way, you're probably 1% on your way. Anyway, I go back to him and I say, when you said it was almost ready for publication, by almost, what percentage are you talking about? What I was hoping he was going to say was 100%, 99 or something. I can't remember exactly the percentage, but it was something like 3% or 5% or 10%. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that makes more sense. At the very least, great, thanks for the compliment that this could be published. But basically he was saying, you have a good germ for an idea that if you really worked at it, you could develop this into a good piece that you could start shopping around for publication or something like that, which probably was not true. He was probably just being nice. But what that did, given his relationship with me, his intensity, his wisdom, his really paying it, really listening to me and making me feel like I could do things. I mean, that's what mentors do, is they make you feel like you can do things that you don't think you can do. They believe in you in ways that you would never believe in yourself. And then they see a vision of you that you think is impossible. And you go, well, but they're my mentors. And I guess I'll start heading in that direction. Before you know it, you have become the vision that they have for you. That's how I wanted to be as a supervisor. And so when I wrote my book, Multi-Role Clinical Supervision, this is the worst book cover of all time. I was poor when I was developing this book and couldn't afford to pay an artist even just like $100. And so I thought I would read a passage from my book that has to do with an influence of him. I will never forget the outstanding supervisors who inspired me to develop as a clinician. These important figures didn't just oversee me, they transformed me. They were a shoulder to lean on and to cry on. I looked up to them. I followed their example. I felt safe with them. They fought for me. They challenged me. They pushed me to grow. These exceptional supervisors were many things to me. They were teachers. They were mentors. They were listeners. They were overseers. They were role models. They were attachment figures. Obviously not as good as his writing, but influenced by him. This idea of attachment. Here's another sentence. My best supervisors paid attention to how I was feeling in the moment. They never made me feel criticized or ashamed. This is very important. There's so much imposter syndrome as a clinician, especially when you're starting out, that you really need an active supervisor mentor who, without prompting, will diminish your shame for yourself and will really try, while giving you feedback and saying you need to change this or that, will never make you feel criticized or shamed. It's a very important balance to strike, and that is all based on a foundation of a secure attachment. You have to develop that relationship where the supervisee feels held by you, feels secure, feels safe, feels like you have unconditional positive regard for them, so that when you do tell them you made a mistake, you need to change it, that criticism, that negative constructive criticism, is on a foundation of love and security. You know what I mean? So anyway, my best supervisors paid attention to how I was feeling in the moment as supervision is going by and as mentoring is going by. They never made me feel criticized or ashamed. They were genuine and honest with me. They told me their own insecurities, by leading the way. They listened as I processed my feelings. When there was a conflict, they humbly apologized. They never imposed their perspective. They gave me the benefit of the doubt. They believed in me, and I felt safe. I did think about Phil when I was writing that book, because he was really the only one that I had that I felt the way that I've been describing. Like I said, like I was his only supervisor. Some of you might relate to this if you have a therapist where you know that they have many clients, but you feel like you are their only client because in the moment they're fully paying attention to you, undivided attention. They're not distracted by things. They care. There's an intensity to the attention that takes a lot of effort, but it's from the value system of the mentor supervisor. They value this. They see the value in it. This is their mission, their calling. It's important to them. It's gratifying to them to make you feel safe, to help guide you, to be there on off hours, That was one of the things that I always tried to provide for my supervisees and my mentees in that way was I would tell them explicitly, because a lot of them would be like, oh, I don't want to bother you. And I'd be like, let's set the record straight. I have 7 supervisees in my private practice, people that hire me as supervisees. I'm not accepting any more supervisees because I don't want to spread myself too thin. And you are my top priority. I have my family, my clients, and then there's you, okay? So if you have a problem, call me. I'm dedicated to helping you. Don't think of yourself as this distant bother in my life. It is a central feature of the meaning of my life to be there for you. So call me, 1. 2, if you don't call me, I will consider that to be a failure on your part because I have made myself available. And if you make a mistake because you felt like you couldn't call me, that's on you. So you're actually going against my rules, so to speak, by not contacting me. So never feel like you're bothering me. And then students would be just below that, and I would tell a similar speech to my students. I'd be like, I have 20 students this quarter. Do not think that you are a bother. I consider this a central feature of my life, because it was. Because as a student, as a supervisee myself, I could sense those professors who actually cared and prioritized me. And those people I was so grateful for. And there were so many other professors that I just knew that I wasn't on the priority list. I was something that could only bother them. You know what I mean? I was only going to get in their way of their life. And that's fine, that's their life. But I think to be a professor, to be a supervisor, to be a mentor, to be a therapist, it's not just a job. It's something that has so much more meaning to it, so much more importance to it. It's a sacredness, really. The relationship between mentor and mentee is sacred. It's something that you should never do lightly. You should never agree to do without accepting the full responsibility, all 19 roles that I talk about. But yeah, so getting back to my conversation with him on the phone, again, we talked about a lot of different things, and he had invited me and Stacy to come out to his house on Vashon, which he would invite me out frequently. And I don't know, it just makes me think, what if I had gone out that night and he would have been with me instead of walking on that road or something? And the road he was walking on, I suspect in his neighborhood, it doesn't have a sidewalk or even a shoulder. So it's possible that someone just didn't see him because there's a lot of trees. And I think it was at a time that in the summer when the sun is starting to set a little earlier. And so he might just have been hard to see along the side of the road, is just my guess. I don't know. Of course, it's not his fault, and people should slow the F down when they're driving on a road like that, but I'm guessing it was an accident. Now, of course, they should have stopped, but they did not, which is, and then you think, if there was medical attention and they had stopped, could he have lived? You're just thinking about stuff like that. You're just like, ugh. But yeah, I told him about how I was full-time podcasting. I mean, he'd always known about the podcast, but I think he just thought of it as this really side thing and it always was for many, many years. When I told him about, that I was doing it all the time and I had like 20 episodes a week, this kind of thing, he's just like, whoa. And he says, oh, I'm going to check it out. And I'm like, oh, really? Are you sure? It's that worry that he's going to think of my content and publications as substandard or something. I mean, he's not a critical person, but he's so smart and so accomplished. I just figured there's nothing I could do that would impress him. And particularly my videos on 90 Day Fiancé. If you just Google me, could be the first thing that comes up. And so I was trying to downplay. I'm like, well, so maybe watch out for, I talk about pop culture. It's probably not very relatable. Maybe you should check out these kind of episodes. And he's like, no, I'll check it out. And and maybe he did, but we never got around to talking about it again. And I'm not painting a very effective picture of him. He was a very nice, thoughtful, humorous, jovial man. He was kind-hearted, kind eyes. He was funny. We would laugh a lot, make jokes a lot, lots of joking. Another thing that his mentorship I've internalized and I always carry with me and have that voice in my head was this one moment when I turned in another paper, a different paper, and I had taken a risk in the second half of the paper talking about a model of psychology of personality. Looking back, it was a terrible section, and I'm embarrassed that I wrote it, honestly. I haven't looked back at the paper, but I remember enough of that section to just cringe. And to tell you the truth, subsequently, I've had students who have written similar sections in their paper, and I'm like, oh, this looks like that section in my paper. Like, yeah, this is bad. It's just, there's arrogance in it. It's like when someone barely understands something, but they write like they think they get it, or I don't know. It just had that nonsense and terribleness to it. I think I was just ignorant. I was just, taking a swing at the fences and missed. But I turned it in, and I remember thinking, this might have been after that paper that he complimented me for, and so I was thinking, oh, this is a great paper, turn it in, yeah. And he gives it back to me, and he has a conversation with me. Like, that's another thing, like he would talk with you about your paper. He wouldn't just, and he sits to me and he's like, so the first half of your paper, really liked it. Really solid ideas, really deep. And I really appreciate this point. You seem to really be getting this stuff that we're talking about in this class, and that makes me feel good. And I'm like, oh, that's great. He says, the second half, you lay out your model for personality and understanding of psychopathology. I'm unconvinced, he says. That's all he said. I'm unconvinced. I mean, just that phrase, I'm unconvinced. It's so specific, right? He could have said it was poorly written, or it's a bad paper, or it doesn't make any sense, or it's arrogant. He didn't even say it's unconvincing. He just said, I'm unconvinced. And so it's such a personal, you can't debate it. And it really made me realize what writing papers was all about, just that mentor moment. He could have avoided that. He could have been like, yeah, the paper's great, good job. But he took the time to kind of break it down section by section, and it made me realize what writing papers was for. It was to convince, right? To compel, to make your ideas understandable and believable, or supported or substantiated, coherent. I did not convince him with my model, with my argument, with my way of seeing things. He just, I'm not convinced. It wasn't mean. It wasn't critical. It cut to the core. It wasn't pleasant to hear, but I needed to hear it. And he was there to help me to develop a more convincing model. He was there to talk about that with me. He didn't just throw me to the wolves. He was like, I'm unconvinced, but let's keep working on it. Let's keep working on how you can convince me. And it wasn't a put down. He wasn't even saying other people wouldn't be convinced. He's just saying, I'm not convinced. And that's a part of mentorship, because he had laid the groundwork by proving himself to be a wise, safe, intelligent, inspired thinker, that when he says he's unconvinced, you're like, oh. Because, honestly, a lot of other professors I've had in my life, if they told me they were unconvinced, I'd be like, well, I don't really respect you. I mean, I like you and I'll respect you, but I don't think of you as a genius. I don't think of you as someone who really spends the time to be precise in your thoughts and your language and your teaching and your lectures and your rhetoric and your understanding. You haven't demonstrated that to me, so okay, you're not convinced. That doesn't really mean much to me. When Phil said that, it was like, oh, like, there's so much behind that. There's so much thought and care and knowledge and wisdom and behind that it means something to me. And so from then on, I was always trying to be convincing to Phil in my mind. That's what a mentor and a true therapist or a true professor will do, is they live with you. They guide you and inspire you and hold you and push you and point you in a direction, give you something to aspire to. And that's what Phil did. He's like, he's like, convince me. You can do it. But this is not that. But you can do it. And the effort, so many times as a professor and as a mentor, the easy road is to just say, good job, student, good job, mentee, good job, client, everyone's good, because no one's going to complain. And it's not likely that you'll get in trouble as a professor. If you have a student that is not doing well, but you say good job and you pass them, you're not going to get in trouble for that. I mean, occasionally you might get a talking to, like, did you pass that student? And be like, well, I don't know, they did well in my class. That's the easy road. The hard road is to be a true mentor, to be a true professor, to take on the job and the responsibility that comes with it, to not only to the public, to protect the public from insufficient clinicians, but also to that student. You owe it to the student that is paying good money and blood, sweat, and tears to be in your class, to risk disapproval from the student by telling them how they need to convince more. They need to work harder. They need to learn more. They need to develop more. That they can develop more. That they can do it. You know, Phil didn't say, I'm unconvinced and you're doomed. And I don't exactly remember what he said, but I walked away saying, like, okay, well, back to the drawing board. You know, let's do this thing. And from that, over the years, for those who know my philosophy or how it changes over time, but how I've developed it, you could say was born in that moment, because I had a pretty loose understanding of how I saw human beings. I mean, I certainly had my ideas, but I didn't have a coherent model. And over the next 10 years, 15 years as a clinician and as a podcaster and supervisor and professor, I started to develop that precise model of understanding. The attachment component, the psychodynamic component, the integrationist component of cognitive and feminism, you know, putting it all together and having a convincing way of describing it, having it worked out, writing it out, because writing is thinking externally. And if you can think well, you can write well. And if you can write well, you can think well. And so putting it into words, writing it out. And so it was born then. So many things happened when he said that in addition, but one additional thing when he says I'm unconvinced was it kind of put me in my place. Because at the time, there was a part of me that just wanted to be done with learning. I just wanted to relax and wanted to believe that I had arrived. But through that statement, I'm unconvinced, I was awakened to the place in my learning curve that I was. And I had to be humble and realize that I had not arrived and probably will never arrive. So wake up, Kirk, like you have a long way to go. You're a quarter of the way through the marathon. You have not arrived at the finish line. So you got to work. You're not there yet. And you have to really acknowledge that. That was important as well. Just that. But that sentence, again, was built after months of building the groundwork, the foundation of our relationship so it could handle that. So I could know what he meant by that in all of its emotional ups and downs. Just, I'm unconvinced. And I would say the same thing to my students. If you've ever been a student of mine, if you're watching this or listening to this, you might go, oh, that's where Kirk got it from, because I would say I'm not convinced. And again, have a strong relationship with those students so that when I said that, they weren't destroyed, hopefully. I don't know. The other two books that I have of his are these ones, Hermeneutic Approaches to Interpretive Research. He wrote this with a bunch of students, actually, and he edited it. Another book that he authored in its entirety is called Travels with the Self, Interpreting Psychology as Cultural History, a similar book to this one. But really, this one is his seminal work, in my opinion. It is a strong contribution to our field. It should be required reading. So yeah, I can't believe that he's gone. At low 77, he seemed really quite young. He seemed sharp. He seemed like he had so much more to accomplish. Like I said, he was talking about how he was working on this book, and the way he wrote, he thought and wrote and revised and had conversations. He would send chapters to other geniuses in the field, particularly relational psychoanalysis, and he would debate about every paragraph. It's like, well, I feel like maybe I should rework this. And, he's just one of those consummate writers and thinkers. He gave talks, he gave lectures in this classical academic sense, and it's sort of a lost art to some extent. Think of it like a TED Talk, but much more written based and no visuals because 100 years ago they didn't have PowerPoint. And so you would write a lecture and then you would just read the lecture. And maybe you go a little bit off script every now and then, but you're basically just reading it, and then the lecture gets published as a lecture, right? And he would give those kinds of talks. And again, every sentence precise and would walk you through this thought process. And by the time you're done, you've absorbed a lot of what he has said, some of which is almost not consciously comprehended, but you get the felt sense of it. Sort of like academic poetry in a way. I'm going to miss that. And I feel like he was such a unique type of professor. And like I said, when we were on the phone, we were talking about how I think I even told him, I said, we need him and more like him. We're losing people like him in my field, in my opinion. And I don't know if this is just old therapist shakes fist at cloud, but I feel like we're heading more and more towards, and maybe they've always said this in my field, I don't know. Sort of like, oh, kids today, I wonder if I'm doing that, but I don't know. It just feels like we're heading, not terribly so, but kind of more towards a less personal, and for good reason on some level, because I've had some colleagues who were if we have a spectrum between humanistic and personal and academic and professional, there are some negative aspects to be too personal and not professional enough, right? You break boundaries, it's unclear what's happening over here half the time, but I think that there's a balance there. And another mentor of mine, Paul David, would talk about how as a therapist, as a professor, as an institution, you want the head and the heart. You want the intellect and the analysis and the professionalism, but you also want the human heart, the love, the connection, the emotion. And you need both. You need to have both present, and you need leadership that models that and values that and promotes that in the students, but also in the institution. And I feel like as our field becomes more mechanistic and more professional and more buttoned up, more worried about lawsuits or something, more striving for legitimacy in the medical community, in society, that tends to value those kinds of things more. We're moving away from the 70s, that we're losing that. And a lot of the older professors who I looked up to, that was their thing, was the humanistic, personal side of things, the thinking side of things, the conversation, the deepness of it. I'm not saying the young people aren't deep. They are in their way, for sure. I worry. And I was more on the professional side of things, really. And so I kind of depended on those older baby boomer types to pull me in that direction. And without them, like Phil, I don't know. I'm kind of worried. And I think Phil was too. I know he was worried about that. And so we were talking about that as well. What do I say in closing? I thought this was just going to be like a 10-minute episode, but all y'all are basically my therapist right now. I'm just imagining that you're listening and caring and thinking about your own losses, your own grief. And I haven't really even talked about grief. Well, okay, so what I'll say is my grief process, if I were to zoom out a bit and look at myself, is part of my pain is expressed and felt and valued through feeling it, calling Rebecca and crying, talking with my wife about it, thinking about him, rereading his books, reminiscing, talking with y'all. This episode is a way to honor him, a way to memorialize him in my way, a way to be there for him if he is watching or in an afterlife, that he would say, oh, okay, that first bit was okay. This last bit I'm unconvinced. I would just like to think that he would appreciate it. This is part of how I want to show effort. It's like when you give a speech at the memorial, or you volunteer at a place that they volunteered, or you reminisce with your family in a formal way and everyone tells a story, or you're at a church and you do a religious ceremony of some kind. I'm a podcaster, and so you could say that some of my episodes are part of a ritual, if you will. Vikings would, I believe, in the movies anyway, they would put you on a boat and light you on fire and set you off to sea, and because Vikings were seafaring people. Well, I'm a podcasting people, and so when I want to have ritual and ceremony and meaning and express myself through a creation publicly, it is through this podcast. If I zoom out a bit on my grief, and I'm just beginning that process with Phil, this is part of it. I don't know. I've been tense, and maybe that's what my stomach was about, was I felt like I had to get all this off my chest, and talking with my wife, talking with Rebecca was part of that as well. But the ability to just kind of systematically free associate about this whole thing, to acknowledge that and to allow yourself to do it, to not deny it, to not be shunned or embarrassed or shamed, because some people will. Be like, oh, you're dwelling in the past, or why do you have to be so morbid, or I'm bored or something. There's a lot of naysayers, there's a lot of pushback because our society doesn't value it. Our capitalistic, materialistic society, there's not a lot of money in death. There's not a lot of power in grief. It's a part of our human experience. Or at least there isn't a lot of money in loss and grief. There's some, and I don't know, maybe in 50 years, it'll be a whole industry that people will capitalize on. Pay us tens of thousands of dollars and we will grieve for you, or we'll tell you how to grieve or something. It's just like, why does everything have to be some sort of service or thing, some sort of thing you pay money for? Why can't we just be humans without all that stuff sometimes? That's what Phil would say. I'm pretty sure. At least that's what the Phil inside of me says. I don't know if that's really Phil, but he's inside of me, and I feel like that's him. And that's another part of it, I guess, is to honor that and to highlight that for myself, that he's not gone from here, right? All right, well, thanks for listening, everyone. Truly, if you're still listening, that means a lot to me, really. Take care of yourself, and I'll take care of myself. Let's all take care of each other because we deserve it. We really, really do.